This is Buried Truths. I'm Hank Klibanoff. From the shadows of the George Washington Carver School, Eloise Franklin has just watched the Macon police shoot her boyfriend, A.C. Hall. Now, the police haven't even seen her yet. But what if they do? If she runs now, will they shoot her too? If she stays, well, who knows? None of what she has just seen makes any sense at all. One minute she's strolling happily with A.C., the boy she would later call her first love, and the next A.C. is shot, and she's frantic. She looks toward the police a final time and then tries to find some way to get to A.C. She reaches the street in front of the school, and a second police car pulls up. The detective behind the wheel asks Eloise why she's so upset. They shot a boy. The police shot a boy, she says. The detectives then race toward the back of the school. Eloise sees A.C. lying in the street, and she runs toward him. Before she can get to him, an ambulance arrives, picks up A.C., and races to the city hospital a few blocks away. Eloise, in her pretty dress, her stockings, those black flats, is left standing there, alone. Suddenly, she starts running again toward the hospital, following in the wake of the ambulance. Eloise never makes it to the hospital. The same detective who stopped her at the school intercepts her again. Did Eloise see the shooting? She says yes. He puts her in the police car, but he doesn't take her to the hospital to see her boyfriend. Again and again, the police ask her, where's the gun? You know, the gun. The gun Doris Hopper saw a colored man taking from her husband's car. For the police, this whole tragedy becomes more justifiable if A.C. Hall had a gun. That gun. So they insist on Eloise telling them. Where's the gun, they ask. But she has no idea what they're talking about. Even before the shooting of A.C. Hall, Macon's black community was buzzing with reports about police violence. Everyone had heard that the police had killed 2 other black men in recent months. Now it was 3. So Macon wasn't Mayberry in 1962. The veneer of civility and gentility covered a deep well of fear and mistrust. Black and white were still separate. White schools, black schools. White restrooms, black restrooms. White burial plots, black ones. Macon is like a lot of southern towns. Now let's take a minute and talk about that. I want to let you know this is my South, the American South, 100 years after the Civil War. In 1962, I'm 13 years old, born and being raised in Alabama. I had friends who could go into their attics and pull down boxes of Confederate uniforms, medals, regalia, family heirlooms. Everywhere, I saw cars with front license plates that showed a disheveled Confederate soldier holding a tattered rebel flag and saying, "Hell no, I ain't forgetting." This South, my South, which had been so willing to quit the United States altogether rather than give up slavery or the infrastructure of white supremacy, was still fighting yesterday's war through my entire childhood. A century after the Civil War, white massive resistance to racial equality remained the constant beating heart of the body politic of the South. I was born in 1949, 5 years before the United States Supreme Court electroshocked that beating heart with its Brown versus Board decision. That ruling struck down segregated public schools in 1954. So entering first grade the next year in 1955, I should have walked into a racially integrated first grade, but it didn't happen, at least not until I was a junior in high school. Along the way, my state only strengthened its resistance when we elected George Wallace as governor. That was in 1962, the same year that A.C. Hall was killed. In his inaugural speech, Wallace delivered this memorable line.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Over in Mississippi, it seemed like the entire state, the white people anyway, were being whipped into a frenzy to stop one man, James Meredith, from becoming the first African American to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Here is their governor, Ross Barnett, at halftime of an Ole Miss football game on September 29, 1962. Now, Ross Barnett is delivering a pointed 16-word speech that used white supremacist code words, customs, heritage, to ignite the crowd's hysteria.
I love Mississippi. I love her people. Our customs. I love and I respect our heritage.
The next day, the campus would erupt. Officials had thought it would be wise to admit James Meredith on a Sunday, but word got out, and by evening, hundreds of white protesters from near and far had flocked to Oxford, Mississippi, into the Ole Miss campus. The mob seized the center of the school and rioted for 15 hours. President John Kennedy sent in 5,000 federal troops. A journalist and a bystander were killed. Here and there across the South, you'd see weakening in the solid wall of resistance. Even in Georgia, in 1961, its governor, who had vowed that no black would ever be allowed in any college or university, in fact, his slogan was, "No, not one," retreated from that stand in fear of a campus riot at the University of Georgia. In fact, he allowed double that number to enroll, 2. That weakening continued in 1962 when Georgia voters elected a genuine racial progressive as governor. His name was Carl Sanders. One of his first orders at the state capitol was pretty direct. Remove the signs that said, "Whites only." Even so, racial conflicts were popping up all over Georgia. Martin Luther King Jr. and other demonstrators were arrested in Albany and southwest Georgia for obstructing sidewalks and parading without a permit. The demonstrators sang "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around" as they were being arrested and carried away by the police. And in Macon, activism was even bolder. 8 months before the death of A.C. Hall, black residents launched a full-scale bus boycott. Their model, Montgomery, Alabama.
We will never stop in Macon until Macon is the best place to live in Georgia.
William P. Randall, known to many as Bill Randall and Billy Randall, was a black construction contractor in Macon. He was also a leader of the community and would later become president of the local chapter of the NAACP. For 8 years, the black community in Macon had been trying to get the attention of the County Transit Authority. And for 8 years, the county transit system had ignored them. So in early 1962, this is 8 months before A.C. Hall was killed, Randall and his colleagues and his followers did something really extraordinary. They bent the white power structure to their will. They started a bus boycott in Macon. It would be organized. It would be nonviolent. It would be brief. Here's Randall whipping up the crowd.
I'll tell you, listen, I'll stop. You don't have to doubt a single man back here. Amen. I've seen them in action. They cannot be intimidated. They cannot be browbeaten, and you just can't scare them. And I only pity those few. who for some excuse or for some reason failed to join this crusade. But we're going to win it because it's right. We're going to win it because we're willing to fight. We're going to win it because God's on our side.
The protesters were demanding an end to segregated buses, and they wanted jobs for black drivers and mechanics. So on the eve of the boycott, Randall told 3,000 people gathered at a local black church, "Don't ride the buses. Walk if you have to. We don't want no half-baked cracker telling us to move to the rear of the bus." But a bus boycott, of course, creates problems. How do people get where they're going? How do they get to their jobs? How do they get to schools? How do they get anywhere? Bill Randall and his followers set up a volunteer motor pool of 200 cars that provided transportation for anyone who needed it. But for kids waiting on the side of the road, you're not going to believe what happened to them. Some of the white bus drivers intentionally drove their buses into puddles to splash mud on the children. Thomas Duvall was a black teenager whose family owned an upholstery store on Cotton Avenue when the bus boycott unfolded. Now a retired dentist, Tom Duvall speaks of that activism with a fierce pride.
The work that Bill Randall did, phenomenal. It was our finest hour, and I'll say it today. Those kind of things were very dangerous kind of things to get involved with at that time. You could lose your job, and it wouldn't be easy for you to circulate around and find another job. So it took a lot of courage to get involved.
But Macon police did everything they could to break up the bus boycott. One tactic, writing parking tickets. Hundreds of them.
Before people in the motor pool could walk up to a parking meter and put the coin in the meter, the police would give them a ticket. The whole deal was they didn't think that black folks were going to stick together and pull this thing off. But they did.
As happened all over the South in the 1950s and the 1960s, a federal judge intervened on the side of the civil rights activists. His ruling, segregated seating, was unconstitutional. 2 days later, the boycott ended. Not a shot was fired. Few, if any, arrests were made. And the protest was pulled off solely by the black residents of Macon. The success of the bus boycott cheered Macon's black community, but it also drove a spike of fear and resentment into the hearts of many whites. In 1962, it was all coming to a head. This was a time when people were having to make choices and take sides. For A.C. Hall, the choice on October 13, 1962, was to run. Why? Why, especially if he had done nothing wrong? Why didn't he just stop and talk with the police? Now let's think about that for a minute. So much of the ugly side of racial history in the South goes this way. Somebody acts, somebody else reacts. Somebody joins the side of the actor, somebody else joins the side of the reactor. This one wins, that one loses. This one goes to court, that one goes for a gun. This one lives, that one dies. And there's very little time in all of that to stop and ask, What's going on here? What's behind all this? And almost always the why is tied to history. Our behavior, who we are, to some extent, large or small, is derived from our past, from who we were. So you're going to hear in this podcast that our behavior in the South was due largely to our racial conditioning. White people were conditioned to believe certain things about black people and to respond a certain way. Black people were conditioned to believe certain things about white people and to respond a certain way. Informed by centuries of bitter experience, African Americans have long harbored fear and resentment toward white police. To see that more clearly, let's look at the roots of policing in the South. If you dig into the history, you'll find that many rural police departments began as slave patrols, white men whose mission was to catch runaways, to quell dissent, to inflict punishment. And this goes back a long time, back to the 1700s. Many of them brought ruthlessness, brutality, and dogs to the job. These slave patrols evolved into rural police departments and sheriff's offices. By the end of the 1800s, Reconstruction had fallen apart. The federal government had abandoned its mission to help former slaves become full, self-sufficient citizens, and the Ku Klux Klan was on the rise. In the early 1900s, you couldn't tell policemen from Klansmen because many of them were. Slavery, as it turned out, hadn't been abolished. It had simply been renamed convict leasing. In his landmark book, Slavery by Another Name, Doug Blackman described in vivid detail how it worked. White sheriffs, in exchange for cash that went to county coffers and to their own pockets, rented their black inmates to companies and farmers as labor. Convict leasing, that is, enslavement, was so lucrative that sheriffs arrested black men on trumped-up charges just so they could keep up the flow of laborers. This system, too, was enforced by white deputies. And then came the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 60s, who enforced these statutes of segregation: white police officers and sheriff's deputies. If you were a black Southerner in the early 1960s, it took very little imagination to connect the modern-day policeman with the olden-day slave patrol. It was the same man. For 200 years and more, white men with unquestioned authority were responsible for enforcing white supremacy. Listen to the voices of African Americans who lived in Macon in 1962 and who still live there today. Ollie Mae Hutchins, Eloise Franklin's friend in later life, talks about A.C. Hall's decision to run from the police.
But back in those days, if a police came at you and you didn't run, they were going to shoot you anyway, so he would try to get away.
Newton Collier, you remember A.C. Hall's friend growing up, he could tell you why A.C. ran.
At that time, Macon police, they did what they wanted to. They beat you down, kick you around. If you're a young teenager, you got caught downtown doing something, things could happen to you. You could get put in jail, but you can get beat up at the same time and no one did anything about it.
Another Macon resident, Herbert Denard, does not recall knowing A.C. Hall, but he knows, as well as anyone, the Macon that A.C. Hall grew up in. He was born there in May 1945, 13 days after A.C. Hall was born. He founded and for 32 years edited a newspaper, the Georgia Informer, aimed at an African-American audience in and around Macon. He talks about the police of the 1960s in pretty stark terms.
If you go to the police, you're going to get beat or locked up or sent to the penitentiary. That was it. They didn't just take you in, oh, we're sorry, we made a mistake. You can go home now, we're sorry. You was going to get beat up, you're going to get shot, degraded, made you lay on the floor. If a woman was with you, she was going to lay down, they're going to look at her and have her take her clothes off and do all kind of things. And they would never be charged.
These were not isolated sentiments. Every black person we spoke to who lived in Macon in the 1960s said the same thing. You ran. Unfortunately, that reflex hasn't really changed much. David Davis has been with the Macon-Bibb County Sheriff's Department for 40 years. He's a white man, elected sheriff in 2012. And here's what he had to say about black attitudes toward police.
We have the same situation sometimes here in 2018. Black kids are going to run from white cops, or black kids are going to run from cops. And this is one of those kind of things when we talk about cultural situations, it continues to this day, that whenever people, minorities, whoever have encounters with law enforcement, they have a preconceived notion as to what the police might be after. And so it's not like a, hey, how you doing? It's like, they after somebody. I just don't want to be the person they after. I need to get away from here as quick as I can.
Sheriff Davis acknowledges that it's different when a white kid sees a cop.
White people are going to be like, well, if he's innocent, why didn't he stay? And a white kid probably would stand there and say, hey, officer, what's going on? A white kid may be guilty of sin, but he's going to stand there and say, hey, officer, what's going on? Whereas a lot of times black kids feel like that they've already been judged a suspect and they're afraid of what's going to happen, so they need to say, I got to get away from here.
A.C. Hall lived in Tyndall Heights. This neighborhood in Macon got its name from the first housing project for black residents. Tyndall Heights was built in the 1940s, and the neighborhood grew up around it, including some modest homes. A.C. Hall lived in one of them, there with his mother and his grandmother. They lived in a shotgun house. What was a shotgun house? Well, the saying goes that it was a small dwelling with a central hallway, and if you fired a shotgun at the front door, the shot would exit the back door without ever striking a wall. Now, right outside of A.C. Hall's front door were some railroad tracks. And in order to visit people like Newt Collier or to go to his first elementary school, he had to walk over the railroad tracks. Now, he wasn't too far from another guy who lived in Tyndall Heights, Otis Redding. Now, Otis Redding grew up in the project of Tyndall Heights. Now, he was 4 years older than A.C. Of course, I can't help but wonder if somehow they knew each other. Remember that I said that A.C. Hall was killed the night he visited the Middle Georgia Veterans Club in the fall of 1962. Well, guess what? Only 3 months before, Otis Redding had done 2 live performances there. So why are we playing the song R-E-S-P-E-C-T? Well, because Otis Redding wrote it. And if you think about Newt Collier and Otis Redding and A.C. Hall, life was a constant struggle to win something that came so easily to white people: respect.
R-E-S-P-E-C-T, find out what it means to me. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, take out T-C-T.
A few minutes ago, you heard from Newt Collier. He remembers Tyndall Heights in its heyday, a tight little neighborhood consisting of the city housing projects, other houses that grew up around it, and a lot of little stores.
When you get back over in Tyndall Heights, and what would happen there, we had nightclub, beauty shop, barber shop, even had a TV shop there, repair shop, shoe shine shop. It was just its own little city all within that area.
A small coal yard lay just over the tracks in Tyndall Heights. Using cups or small buckets, Newt Collier and A.C. Hall would harvest the bits and pieces that fell to the ground. They could sell those pieces to put a few coins into their pockets.
But sometimes you'll just go and pick up the fragments of coal that's on the side of the tracks. You knew people had to burn coal, especially if guys were going to be doing barbecuing in the yard. You want to catch them.
On the night of October 13th, 1962, A.C. Hall would run past the police car and straight up the hill toward the coal yard and the railroad tracks. Now, about those railroad tracks, there was something else the kids of Tyndall Heights learned that outsiders could never figure out. How to run on the railroad tracks, how to establish a stride that landed their feet on the railroad ties for maximum speed. Railroad ties are set 18 inches apart. A running kid could establish a stride of 36 inches and land on every other tie. Now, this wasn't easy. In fact, it could be dangerous. Newt Collier says the kids of Tyndall Heights got good at hitting the rhythm.
If you get a stride going, you can be just like a gazelle on that. You can just step at a certain gauge and you can run the tracks.
And that stride is not the normal stride.
No, it's a certain gauge.
And the police wouldn't know.
They wouldn't know that. They would not know that.
A.C. Hall knew where the tracks were. He knew they were the most direct route to his home in Tyndall Heights. All he had to do that night was make it the 100 yards to the tracks, and he'd be home free. So, what might life have been like for A.C. Hall if he had made it to those railroad tracks? Think of it. A.C. Hall was born in 1945. The war has ended. The world has changed. Now, if A.C. Hall were alive today, he'd be 74. So he could have lived to see the new millennium. No way to know, but he might have won a Medal for Valor in Vietnam in the 1960s. He might have graduated from college. He might have married, had a family of his own. My point is that A.C. Hall was 17 when he died, and the world that was about to open to a young black man like him 10, 20, 30 years ahead was unlike anything this nation had ever seen. Had he not been shot and killed, there's reason to think he might have had a long and fulfilling life, and here's why. Black mothers, knowing everything their sons had to face, were particular about how they raised them. A.C. Hall's mother, Curly Hall, and other moms taught their children what might broadly be called respectability. Historian Jennifer Ritterhouse, in her book, Growing Up Jim Crow, How Black and White Southern Children Learned Race, writes that black mothers schooled their children in such values as temperance, thrift, hard work, good manners. A child so equipped would be neither threatening nor disrespectful to white people. Make them inconspicuous to increase their chances of survival. This was the stark calculus that black mothers used if they wanted their sons to live into adulthood. Curly Hall had observed these rules, and she'd brought up her son to the threshold of manhood. By now, you know that she dressed him nicely. She made sure he was cleaned up. She starched his jeans. You can see her as she sends him off to a school picture day, standing in front of him, straightening his collar, taking him in with her eyes. He looks so much like her. And you can imagine how, when the school photo arrived home, she might have proudly put it in a frame and placed it in a prominent place in her home. Curly Hall, who passed away years ago, was in her early 30s back in 1962. She was seasoned in the racial conditioning of the South, but she couldn't anticipate every situation A.C. might encounter. She couldn't train A.C. to avoid a gesture as innocent as walking with a girl at night. He died running home to her, 3 blocks away. It helps me, and it may help you, to know this. Curly and A.C. Hall, mother and son, have been together for more than 4 decades, buried side by side. Next on Buried Truths. The day after A.C. Hall was killed, the story hit the newspaper's front page, and it stayed there for days. Suddenly, there's going to be an official inquiry, an inquest, and unexpectedly, it looks like someone's going to have to answer for what happened that night. You'll meet a man who was there, a black civil rights attorney who went to Macon in 1962 to represent the family of A.C. Hall.
I thought first when I came into the courthouse that there were 3,000 Negroes on the steps. From one side of the steps of the courthouse to the other was nothing but Negroes.
Buried Truths is a production of WABE, Atlanta. We have a newsletter where you can see photos and documents from the case, as well as links to some of the things that were mentioned in today's episode. You can sign up for our newsletter at wabe.org/buriedtruths. Also, follow us on social media. We're at Buried Truths Podcast. And of course, as always, please subscribe if you haven't already and leave us a review. It'll help others find this show. If you have any information related to this case, write or send a voice memo to hank@buriedtruths.org. Hank Klibanoff is a former newspaper reporter and editor and co-author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Race Beat. Today, he's a professor at Emory University. The Buried Truths team includes David Bereswain, Richard Hallex, Catherine Dautrick, Marilyn G-Wax, Jayanne Berry, and Christine Dempsey. Thanks to Emory University and its Centers for Digital Scholarship and Faculty Excellence, to the University of Georgia's Civil Rights Digital Library, and another big thanks to the nearly 100 students who've taken the Civil Rights Cold Cases class that Hank Klibanoff teaches at Emory. And thank you for listening to Buried Truths.